Maya had been living on Karath 9 for 5 years when the first signs of the awakening appeared. She worked as a translator for the human colony, though the humans rarely needed her services anymore. Most of them had learned to survive on their own, to make their own decisions without asking for guidance from the elves or any other magical beings. The Federation had deemed the presence of traditional magic as unnecessary in the modern age of space travel and advanced technology. But Maya stayed because staying was easier than leaving, and because the dragons had nowhere else to go. The colony itself was built into the side of a massive canyon that cut through the northern continent. Humans had chosen this location for its natural protection and its proximity to rare mineral deposits that could be sold back to the Federation for profit. The colony was home to about 2,000 people now, a mix of scientists, miners, engineers, and families who had decided that life on a distant planet was preferable to the crowded worlds closer to human space. There was something about Karath 9 that called to people who did not fit into normal society, who wanted something more dangerous and real than what the core worlds offered. Maya had rented a small dwelling at the edge of the colony, far enough from the main structures that she could maintain her privacy, close enough that she could still access supplies and information. The dwelling was built of stone harvested from the local quarries, with large windows that faced toward the mountains where Kresh spent most of his time. Amara often came to visit her, curling up in the courtyard to soak in the heat of the twin suns. The dragons were not pests or problems. The colony administrator had issued a directive that they were to be left unmolested, and most people followed that directive without question. Claire was different from most of the colonists. She had arrived 3 months ago on one of the supply ships, a young woman with an obsession with geology and planetary science that bordered on obsession. Her hair was bright red, almost orange in certain lights, and she was always asking questions. Endless questions about Karath 9, about its structure and age and history. She had somehow discovered that Maya was not purely human, and had decided that made Maya an expert on everything planetary and magical. On the day before the first tremor, Claire had come to Maya's dwelling with a portable scanner that looked like something from a medical facility. She was excited in the way that made people nervous, bouncing on her feet and talking rapidly about discoveries and implications and the need for further investigation. Maya had offered her tea made from plants that grew in the colony gardens, a simple courtesy that Claire had accepted while still talking without pause. Claire said that the sensors had detected something unusual in the planet's mantle. The energy readings were inconsistent with normal geological activity. There were patterns to them, rhythms that suggested something more than simple plate tectonics or core convection. She wanted to know if Maya had ever heard of anything like this before, if the old stories contained any information about unusual planetary phenomena. Maya had sipped her tea and tried to explain that the old stories were metaphors and myths, not literal historical records. But Claire was not convinced. The first tremor came that night. It was small, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. The ground shifted for just a moment, like something far below had turned over in its sleep. Maya felt it through the bond with the dragons. Kresh was already awake on the mountainside, already aware that something was disturbing the deep places of the world. Amara had come to Maya immediately, her scales warm and slightly agitated, pressing against Maya's legs in the darkness of the dwelling. By morning, the colony was abuzz with activity. Seismic sensors had detected multiple tremors throughout the night, each one slightly stronger than the last. The research team had declared a level 2 alert, which meant increased monitoring but no evacuation procedures. Thomas Gray, the colony administrator, had held a meeting in the central plaza to explain that there was likely nothing to worry about. Karath 9 was geologically active, he said. The settling of the planetary crust was a normal and expected phenomenon. They would continue their normal activities while the science team monitored the situation. Claire appeared at Maya's door the next morning with even more equipment. She was convinced that this was the event she had been waiting for, the opportunity to do real science and make a discovery that would matter. She wanted to go deeper into the caves that riddled the canyon walls, to place sensors in locations that would give better readings of what was happening in the planet's depths. She asked Maya if she would come with her, if the elves had any knowledge about which caves were safe to enter and which ones should be avoided. Maya should have said no. She should have refused and sent Claire away, and returned to her quiet life on the edge of the colony. But she saw something in Claire's eyes that reminded her of herself when she was young. That hunger to understand the world, and to be part of something meaningful, so she agreed to go with her. to guide her into the safe caves and to help her place the sensors in locations that might give useful data. They spent the day moving through the lower canyons, through passages that had been carved by water millions of years ago, when Karath 9 had been a warmer world with more moisture. Claire was taking measurements constantly, making notes in her portable device talking about thermal gradients and mineral composition, and the possibility of discovering new geological formations. Maya walked beside her and tried not to think about what the dragons were telling her through the bond, about the sense of wrongness coming from the very deepest places. The caves became deeper and narrower as they descended. Eventually, they reached a point where Claire's equipment was giving her the readings she wanted, and she began to set up the sensor array. Maya waited beside her, watching the walls and the shadows, listening to the sounds of the planet breathing around them. There was water somewhere below. She could hear it and something else. A sound like something large moving in its sleep, shifting position after a long time of stillness. Claire finally finished her work, and they began the climb back up toward the surface. It was darker than it had been when they entered, the light from the single sun above the canyon rim fading as the afternoon progressed. They made good time through the familiar passages, but as they neared the exit, the ground beneath their feet shifted again. This tremor was stronger than the previous ones, strong enough to make loose stones fall from the ceiling, and to send echoes through the caves that sounded almost like voices calling from below. Claire fell during the tremor, her foot catching on a stone that had dislodged from the ground. Maya caught her before she fell completely, pulling her back up and holding her steady as the shaking continued. When it finally stopped, Claire was shaking. Her earlier excitement replaced with fear. She wanted to leave immediately, to get out of the caves and back to the safety of the colony. Maya helped her, and they made their way upward as quickly as they could without taking dangerous chances. When they emerged from the cave mouth, they could see the colony below them. There were emergency lights flashing and people were moving through the streets in organized patterns that suggested some kind of alert was in effect. Thomas Gray had likely upgraded the warning level, but more than that, Maya could feel the dragon's concern through the bond, a deep and abiding worry that suggested something fundamental was changing in the planet beneath them. Claire went immediately to report to the research team, leaving Maya at the cave entrance. Maya stood there for a long time looking out over the colony and beyond it, to the mountains where Kresh waited. She could feel the dragon's consciousness reaching toward her, trying to communicate something important. She closed her eyes and opened herself to the bond, allowing his perceptions to flow into her mind. What she felt there was ancient and terrible and sad. Kresh was showing her memories, not his own but older, inherited from generations of dragons before him. He was showing her the time before the humans came, when Karath 9 was home to many magical creatures. He was showing her a civilization that had built great cities in these canyons, a people who had worked in harmony with the planet and its deeper layers. And then he was showing her something else, something that lived in the deepest places, something that the ancient people had learned to respect and to fear. Maya opened her eyes and began walking toward the mountains. She had work to do, and it was better done away from the questions of curious humans. Behind her, the colony continued with its evening routines, unaware that the world beneath their feet was waking up after a sleep that had lasted for thousands of years, unaware that within days everything would change, and nothing would ever be simple again. The twin moons rose over Karath 9, and in their light Maya could see Kresh descending from his mountainside home, moving toward her with purpose and urgency. She quickened her pace to meet him, and together they turned to face the direction of the deepest canyons where something was stirring in the darkness below. The tremors came with increasing frequency as the days passed. By the third day, the colony had been raised to alert level 4, which meant limited evacuation preparations had begun. Families with young children were being gathered into the central shelter, a bunker that had been constructed decades ago when the colony was first established. The shelter was designed to withstand a magnitude 8 earthquake and the collapse of nearby structures. It could not defend against something that lived beneath the planet itself. Maya spent most of her time with the dragons now, barely returning to the colony except to gather supplies and information. She needed to understand what was happening beneath the surface, what exactly was beginning to stir in the deep places. Kresh was trying to communicate with whatever was waking, sending out calls through channels that Maya could feel but not fully comprehend. The responses that came back were slow at first, confused and disoriented, like something gradually regaining consciousness after a very long sleep. Claire had not stopped trying to find Maya. The young geologist appeared at the cave entrance on the 4th day, carrying heavy equipment and wearing a look of desperate determination. She had gone to Thomas with her theory about what was causing the tremors, about a massive underground structure or organism that was beginning to move. Thomas had dismissed her concerns as speculation without evidence, so Claire had decided to get her evidence herself. Maya found her in one of the upper caves, setting up sensors and recording devices in a chamber that seemed particularly active. The ground here was warm, almost too warm to stand on for long periods. Claire looked up as Maya entered, relief and excitement crossing her face in equal measure. She had been hoping Maya would come, she said. She had known that Maya understood this planet in ways the human scientists did not, that Maya would be able to guide her toward the truth. Maya asked her to leave. She said that the caves were not safe and that whatever Claire was trying to discover was not worth putting her life in danger. But Claire was stubborn in the way of young people, convinced that she was right and that the adults around her were simply not brave enough to pursue the real answers. She said she was going to place these final sensors even if Maya did not want to help, and then she was going to get real data that the colony could not ignore. Maya realized in that moment that she could not stop Claire through words or warnings. The young woman had already made her decision. So instead, Maya made a different choice. She opened the connection between herself and the dragons completely, removing all barriers, and she asked them to help her understand what was waking beneath Kareth 9. What came back through the bond was overwhelming in its intensity and strangeness. Kresh had made contact with the consciousness below. It was not a single creature, he showed her, but a network of connected beings, something like a civilization or an organism that existed at a scale humans could barely comprehend. They had been sleeping for thousands of years, ever since the ancient people had built their protective barriers and their pacts with the magical creatures. But the barriers were weakening now, worn down by time and the weight of so much dormant life pressing upward from below. Maya understood then what had happened. The tremors were not random geological activity. They were the sleeping giants trying to wake, trying to reach the surface, trying to remember what it felt like to exist in the world above. And if they succeeded in breaking through the old barriers, if they emerged into the world without understanding what had changed in the thousands of years since they slept, there would be catastrophe, not because they were evil, but because they were so much larger and more powerful than anything currently living on the surface. She told Claire everything. She sat down in that warm chamber and explained about the ancient pacts, about the creatures beneath the earth, about the danger that was approaching. She explained that the colony needed to prepare not for a disaster to be prevented, but for a negotiation that might save everyone's lives. Claire listened with her characteristic intensity, and when Maya finished speaking, the young geologist began nodding slowly. Claire said she understood. She said the sensors she had placed would give them data about the creatures' movement patterns, their size and distribution, the ways they were trying to break through the barriers. With that data, she could calculate how long they had before the barriers failed completely. With that information, they could develop a plan. They could prepare the colony for contact with an intelligent species, instead of just cowering in a shelter and hoping for the best. They emerged from the caves as the afternoon sun was beginning to paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and red. The colony was below them, going about its evening routines as if the world was not fundamentally changing. Thomas had scheduled a public meeting for that evening to address the growing concerns about the seismic activity. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for Claire to present her findings, or at least to present the beginnings of them. But first, Maya needed to do something else. She needed to go to Kresh and to fully understand what the creatures below wanted, what they needed from the surface world, whether there was any possibility of peaceful coexistence. She left Claire at the cave entrance with instructions to return to the colony and to prepare her presentation. They would meet at Thomas's meeting and present their combined findings. Kresh was waiting on the ridge, his massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. When Maya reached him, she climbed onto his shoulders and they descended into the deepest canyon, into passages that Kresh knew and understood, but that Maya had never traveled before. The further down they went, the warmer the air became, until Maya felt like she was moving through the lungs of a living world. The barrier became visible as they descended deeper. It was not physical in any normal sense, but rather a kind of energy field that had been crafted by ancient magic. It hung in the air like a veil between two worlds. And on the other side of it, Maya could see vast shapes moving in the darkness. These were not small creatures. They were immense, their bodies composed of stone and something else, something that seemed almost like organized energy or consciousness given physical form. Kresh began to sing. It was a deep sound, one that seemed to come from the earth itself, and Maya found herself singing along, using the ancient language that she had learned as a child, but had rarely spoken in all her years away from her people. The song was not in words exactly, but in concepts and meanings, a way of communicating that transcended the limitations of spoken language. Through the song, through the bond with Kresh and the connection to the creatures below, Maya began to understand. The creatures were not hostile. They were confused and lonely. They had been separated from the surface world for so long that they had almost forgotten it existed. They had built a civilization in the depths, cities carved from stone and crystal, societies that were ancient and complex and utterly foreign to human understanding. But their world was dying. Slowly, over millions of years, resources were depleting and there was no renewal of what they needed to survive. They had to wake. They had to break through the barriers and find another way to continue existing. Maya showed them through the song and the connection that there were humans above and other beings like herself, and that if they broke through the barriers in violence, all of those beings would perish. But if they came through with intention and purpose, if they could establish contact and begin communication, perhaps the surface dwellers could help them find a new path. Perhaps together, both the surface and the depths could find a way to coexist and to support each other. The creatures seemed to understand. Their movement slowed. The pressure against the barrier became less frantic, more deliberate, and in the depths, something massive began to move toward the barrier from the other side. It was larger than the others, older, with a presence that felt immense and terrible and sad. It was their leader, Maya realized, the oldest of them, the one who remembered when the barriers were first built, who had lived through the entire time of separation. This creature pressed gently against the barrier, and Maya felt its consciousness reaching toward her, reaching through the barrier, asking questions that had no words. It wanted to know if the surface had survived without them. It wanted to know what had changed. It wanted to know if there was any possibility that the ancient pacts could be renewed, that separation could become connection once again. Maya promised that she would help them. She promised that she would take this knowledge to the humans and to the other magical beings, and that she would do everything in her power to create understanding between the depths and the surface. It was a promise that she was not entirely sure she could keep, but it was the only promise that made sense to make in that moment. Kresh carried her back up through the caves as the night deepened. By the time they reached the surface, the first stars were appearing in the sky above Karath 9. The colony was lit up below them, emergency lights and regular lights mixing together in patterns that suggested worry and preparation. Thomas's meeting would be starting soon, and Maya knew that she needed to be there. The central plaza was crowded with people when Maya arrived. Thomas Gray stood on an elevated platform, speaking into a communication device that broadcast his words throughout the colony. He was explaining the seismic activity in scientific terms, talking about probability distributions and stress points in the planetary crust. The crowd was listening with varying degrees of attention, some people worried and hanging on every word, others looking bored or skeptical. Claire was already there, standing near the front with her portable equipment, waiting for a chance to speak. When she saw Maya enter the plaza, she waved urgently, gesturing for her to come join her at the front. Maya moved through the crowd, aware that people were staring at her. An elf in their midst was always an oddity, a reminder that the universe contained things they did not fully understand. Thomas finished his explanation and opened the floor for questions. Claire raised her hand immediately. Thomas recognized her with a smile that suggested he was used to her frequent questions. Claire asked if he had considered the possibility that the seismic activity was not just random geological occurrence, but rather something more organized, something that suggested intelligent movement beneath the surface. The smile on Thomas's face faded a bit. He said that such speculation was not productive without evidence. Claire said she had evidence. She had placed sensor arrays in multiple locations throughout the deep caves, and the data she had collected suggested patterns that could not be explained by normal tectonic activity. She began pulling up graphs and charts on her portable device, showing them on a larger screen that had been set up for the meeting. The data was compelling even to the untrained eye. There was definitely something moving in coordinated patterns beneath the surface. Thomas asked what her explanation was for this unusual activity. Claire hesitated, and Maya could see her gathering her courage. Claire said that there was evidence suggesting underground structures of considerable size and complexity, and that these structures appeared to contain organisms or entities of unknown nature. And then she said something that made several people in the crowd gasp. She said it was possible they were not dealing with a natural disaster, but with contact with an intelligent underground civilization. The plaza erupted. People shouted questions and concerns. Some called out that this was absurd speculation, that there was no evidence of any civilization under the ground. Others demanded to know if this meant the colony was in danger. Thomas raised his hands, trying to restore order, but the crowd was already panicking. Maya stepped forward, moving onto the raised platform where Thomas and Claire were standing. Her presence seemed to shock everyone into momentary silence. Thomas looked surprised to see her taking action, but he did not stop her. Maya began speaking, her voice clear and steady despite the anxiety she felt at being the center of attention. She spoke about the ancient records of Karath 9, about the time before humans came, when this planet had been home to creatures of great power and intelligence. She spoke about the old pacts and the agreements that had been made to keep these beings separated from the surface world. Not because they were evil, but because their existence had to be managed carefully. She explained that those barriers were failing, that the beings beneath were beginning to wake, and that the colony had a choice to make. They could respond with violence and fear, and attempt to seal the barriers further, a choice that would likely fail and lead to catastrophe, or they could respond with wisdom and openness, making contact with the underground beings, establishing communication, and working to create a new kind of coexistence that might benefit both the surface and the depths. Maya said that she had already begun the preliminary contact process, and that the underground creatures were willing to negotiate if the surface dwellers would meet them halfway. The plaza was completely silent now. People were staring at her with a mixture of wonder, fear, and skepticism. Thomas was looking at her with an expression that suggested he was trying to determine if she was serious, or if this was some kind of elaborate joke. Finally, one of the council members, a woman named Margaret who handled all matters related to governance, stepped forward and asked Maya if she was sure about this. Was she certain that these creatures would not simply destroy the colony if given the chance? Maya said that she was not certain of anything, but that the only way to find certainty was to attempt communication. She said that she had felt the consciousness of the ancient beings beneath the planet, and that they were not monsters but thinking creatures with culture and history and concerns about their own survival. They wanted to exist in this world, yes, but not at the cost of destroying everything on the surface. Margaret asked what she proposed. Maya suggested that they establish a formal negotiation, with representatives from the colony meeting, with representatives from the underground civilization. She would serve as translator, using her understanding of both worlds to facilitate communication. Kresh and Amara could also serve as intermediaries, as the dragons were respected by both the surface creatures and the deeper ones due to their ancient nature. Thomas looked at Margaret, and Margaret looked at the other council members who were scattered throughout the crowd. There was a long silence while various unspoken communications seemed to pass between them. Finally, Margaret asked how much time they had. Maya said she was not sure, but probably a few days at most before the barriers began to fail completely. If they wanted to establish contact on their own terms, they needed to act quickly. The council called for a vote. They did not have the authority to make this kind of decision unilaterally, but they could recommend it to the colony as a whole. The vote was surprisingly close, but in the end, the majority of colonists agreed that they should attempt negotiation rather than prepare for conflict. Thomas was given authority to establish a negotiating team with Maya and Claire as primary advisors. Over the next 2 days, they prepared. Maya worked with a team to create a temporary shelter in one of the upper caves, a neutral territory where the surface dwellers and the underground creatures could meet without either side, feeling like they were entering the other's domain. Claire continued to gather data, tracking the movements of the underground beings and predicting where the barriers would fail first. Thomas organized the human negotiating team, selecting people with experience in diplomacy and science who could represent the colony's interests without being overly hostile or defensive. Amara had taken up residence in the negotiation chamber, her small green form becoming a familiar presence that seemed to calm the anxious humans who worked in the space. Kresh was in the deep caves with Maya and the underground creatures, maintaining the preliminary communication channels and making sure that both sides understood the intention to negotiate in good faith. On the third morning after the plaza meeting, the first barrier failed. The tremor that accompanied it was significant enough to cause structural damage in some of the colony's buildings, but not catastrophic. The protection spells that Maya had reinforced the night before seemed to have worked. They had bought themselves time and a controlled breach rather than a violent one. From this breach point, the first underground creature came forward. It was not the massive one that Maya had felt in her earlier contact, but a smaller one, perhaps only 4 times the size of Kresh, with scales that seemed to be composed of crystal and stone mixed together. Its eyes were amber and intelligent, and when it looked at Maya, she could feel its surprise at seeing an elf in this place, a being that it remembered from the ancient times. Maya stepped forward to greet it, speaking in the old language that the creatures understood. She introduced herself and explained that she had been chosen by the surface dwellers to serve as translator and guide. The underground creature made a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been something else entirely. It said that fate had brought her to this place at exactly the right moment, that an elf's presence meant that the old ways had not been completely forgotten, that perhaps there was still a chance for restoration. This creature agreed to carry the message back to the deepest places, to the oldest ones who still remembered the ancient pacts. It agreed to bring formal representatives to the negotiation chamber for a proper meeting between the civilizations, and before it left, it did something that surprised Maya. It touched her forehead gently with one of its crystalline appendages, and through that touch Maya felt a flash of memory. She saw ancient Karath 9 as it had been thousands of years ago, a world shared by many species, a world where magic and science existed in balance and harmony, and she understood in that moment what they were all fighting for. It was not just survival, though that was important. It was the possibility of restoring something beautiful that had been lost, of bringing back the days when the world was full of wonder and the different beings respected each other's existence. With that understanding came renewed determination. She turned to Thomas and Claire and the other humans who were waiting in the chamber, and she told them that the negotiations would begin by tomorrow night. The negotiation chamber had been transformed overnight. Thomas had authorized the use of colonial resources to create a space that would honor both the surface dwellers and the underground creatures. There were raised platforms for the humans and elves, and lower areas with heat-resistant surfaces where the stone-based creatures could rest comfortably. Ancient crystals had been arranged in patterns that Maya recognized from the old stories, patterns designed to facilitate communication and promote understanding between different species. Maya stood in the center of the chamber as the sun began to set outside the cave entrance, watching as the first representatives from the underground civilization emerged from the breach in the barrier. There were 5 of them, each one larger and more complex than the one that had come before. They moved with a kind of careful grace despite their massive size, clearly aware that they could cause tremendous damage if they were careless in this confined space. The largest of them approached Maya directly. This creature was different from the others, more angular with patterns of crystal running through its stone-like form that glowed with a faint inner light. Through the bond with Kresh and through the dragon's ancient memories, Maya recognized this as one of the eldest, a being that had lived through the original barrier construction, who remembered the time of separation and the reasons for it. This creature spoke, and though it did not use words in any conventional sense, Maya understood perfectly. It said that it was called Keeper of Memory, and that it had served as the voice of the underground civilization for 3,000 human lifetimes. It said that the emergence was necessary because the depths could no longer sustain them all, that the resources were depleted, and the population was growing sick from long stagnation. It asked if the surface had enough resources to share, if the ancient hostilities had truly been forgotten. Thomas stepped forward to respond, but Maya placed a hand on his arm and suggested that she handle the initial exchange. Thomas hesitated but then nodded, understanding that this was a matter best handled by one who understood both worlds. Maya spoke in the old language again, using concepts and meanings that could be understood across the gap between species. She told Keeper of Memory that the surface had changed greatly since the barrier was built. Humans now called this world home, along with other magical beings and the last of the elf population scattered across the outer territories. She said that the colony understood the concept of resource depletion and survival, because humans too had left worlds that could no longer support them. She said that she believed coexistence was possible, but it would require compromise from both sides. Keeper of Memory seemed to consider this. The crystal patterns running through its form pulsed with light as it appeared to communicate with the other underground creatures without sound or obvious movement. Finally, it spoke again, asking what kind of compromise Maya had in mind. What did the surface dwellers want from the depths, and what were they willing to offer in return? This was the moment that they had all been waiting for. Maya had spent days with Thomas and Claire and the other council members discussing exactly this question. They needed to find a solution that would benefit both populations, while creating a stable new order for Karath 9. What emerged was a proposal that Maya now presented to Keeper of Memory. The surface colony would provide access to the upper regions of the planet, allowing the underground creatures to establish settlements in caves and caverns that did not interfere with human habitation. In exchange, the underground civilization would share knowledge about the planet's geological structure and the deep resources that existed in the lower depths. They would also help the surface dwellers understand the ancient magic that still flowed through Karath 9, resources that had been neglected since the separation. Additionally, Maya proposed that the dragons would serve as ambassadors between the two civilizations, maintaining peace and facilitating communication. They would establish regular councils where representatives from both worlds could meet and discuss matters of mutual concern, and most importantly, they would work together to heal the damage that had been done to the planet during the long years of separation and dormancy. Keeper of Memory was silent for a very long time. The other underground creatures seemed to be waiting for its response with a kind of reverent patience. Finally, the ancient being spoke again. It said that this proposal was more generous than it had dared hope for. It said that it remembered when the elves had made similar offerings to other underground species, back in the days when the world was full of living harmony. It said that to hear such words again brought something that might be called hope into a consciousness that had almost forgotten such emotions. But Keeper of Memory also warned that not all of its people would accept this readily. There were those in the depths who had come to see the surface dwellers as enemies, who wanted to emerge and claim what they could before the surface rejected them. There were young creatures who had never known the surface world, and who were skeptical of the possibility of peace. Creating stable coexistence would require work and patience and constant effort to overcome the prejudices and fears that had accumulated during the long separation. Thomas asked directly if Keeper of Memory and its people would agree to the proposal despite these challenges. Keeper of Memory approached Thomas, and the human stood his ground despite his obvious fear at facing a creature so much larger and more powerful than himself. The ancient being reached out and touched Thomas gently with one crystalline appendage, and through that contact, Thomas seemed to understand something. When he stepped back, his expression had changed. He nodded firmly and said that he believed this creature was sincere, and that the colony would honor this agreement. The formal negotiations continued deep into the night. Claire worked with one of the underground creatures to discuss the planetary geology and the resources that might be accessed safely without destabilizing the entire planetary structure. Thomas established the basic framework for the new governance system, with representatives from both the surface colony and the underground civilization, meeting regularly to address disputes and coordinate activities. Maya continued to serve as translator, ensuring that nothing was lost in the exchange of concepts between the two species. By the time the sun rose over Karath 9 the next morning, a preliminary peace agreement had been drawn up. It was not perfect, and both sides knew there would be challenges ahead, but it was a beginning. Keeper of Memory and the other underground representatives agreed to return to the depths and present the proposal to their entire civilization, asking for a formal vote on whether to accept the peace terms. They would return in 3 days with the results, and if the vote was positive, the real work of integration would begin, mapping out the new settlements, establishing trade routes, training humans and surface creatures to work alongside the underground beings. There was so much to do, and Maya knew that this was only the very beginning of a long and complicated process. As the underground creatures departed through the barrier, returning to the depths, Maya found herself standing next to Kresh. The great dragon placed his scaled head gently against her shoulder, and through their bond he conveyed feelings of approval and hope. Amara came bounding over, her smaller form full of energy and enthusiasm for the future that was beginning to unfold. Claire approached Maya with a tired but genuine smile. She said that this was the beginning of a new age for Karath 9, an age where the boundaries between surface and depths would begin to blur and merge. She said that she wanted to be part of this process, that she wanted to document it and understand it and help it succeed. Maya told her that they would need all the help they could get, and that Claire's contribution would be essential to the success of the integration. Thomas appeared, looking more exhausted than Maya had ever seen him, but also more alive. He said that the colony needed to begin preparations immediately. They needed to identify suitable caves for underground settlements, establish resource distribution systems, and prepare the human population for the reality of living alongside an entirely new civilization. It was overwhelming and impossible and necessary all at once. Maya looked out at the canyon walls around them, at the colony below, and the mountains beyond. At all the beauty and complexity of Karath 9, she thought about how much had changed in just a few days, how quickly the universe could shift when circumstances forced it to, and she felt grateful, despite her exhaustion, that she had been here to witness this moment and to help make it possible. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was a future that contained possibility and hope, and that was more than she had dared to want when she first arrived on this distant world. The 3 days of waiting felt longer than 3 months. The colony was in a state of anxious preparation, with work crews beginning to map the deeper caves and survey potential settlement areas. Thomas had organized teams to prepare supplies and resources that might be needed if the underground civilization voted to accept the peace agreement. Everywhere Maya looked, there was activity and conversation. People trying to process what was happening and what it meant for their futures. Claire had become central to the planning process. She worked constantly, analyzing geological data and providing recommendations about which caves were structurally sound for permanent habitation. Her initial curiosity had transformed into something deeper, a genuine desire to help make this integration successful. Maya watched her working with the survey teams and felt something like pride at what the young geologist had become. This was what happened when people were given the opportunity to be part of something meaningful, when they were trusted to help shape history, instead of just experiencing it passively. Amara and Kresh spent their time moving between the colony and the deeper caves. They were helping to establish communication pathways, ensuring that both sides maintained awareness of each other's movements and intentions. The dragons were natural ambassadors, their presence somehow reassuring to both humans and the ancient underground creatures. Maya could feel their satisfaction through the bond, a sense that they were finally fulfilling the purpose they had always been meant for. On the evening of the 3rd day, the tremors came again. They were different this time, rhythmic and intentional rather than chaotic. Keeper of Memory was returning with news. Maya made her way immediately to the negotiation chamber, where Thomas was already waiting with the other council members. Claire had been asleep but came running when the news reached her, still pulling on her outerwear as she entered the chamber. The underground creatures emerged through the barrier in a formation that suggested ceremony. Keeper of Memory was at the front, followed by dozens of other beings of various sizes and shapes. Maya had not realized that the underground civilization was so diverse, so full of different types of creatures living in different roles and positions. There were small ones that moved quickly and seemed to serve as messengers, massive ones that radiated strength and appeared to be builders or defenders, and some that were ethereal and translucent, seeming to exist partially outside the normal physical reality. Keeper of Memory approached Thomas and Maya with a deliberation that made the moment feel sacred. The ancient creature spoke, and Maya translated its words for the humans gathered. It said that the vote had been overwhelming. The underground civilization had chosen peace over conflict, coexistence over confrontation. Keeper of Memory said that there had been those who voted against the agreement, who still harbored fears and doubts, but the majority had decided to embrace the possibility of a new era. It said that Keeper of Memory had been chosen as the primary representative of the underground civilization in all future negotiations and communications. With the surface colony, it said that other representatives would be sent to establish residency in the designated caves, and that work should begin immediately on creating the infrastructure necessary to support peaceful integration. Most importantly, Keeper of Memory said that it had brought something else from the depths, something that had been preserved from ancient times. The ancient creature turned, and from the gathered underground beings emerged another creature that seemed to radiate power and authority. This one was different from Keeper of Memory and the others. It seemed to be composed more of energy than matter, with a form that was almost humanoid but that shifted and changed as it moved. Keeper of Memory introduced this being as Voice of the Deep, the oldest consciousness in the underground civilization, the one who had personally established the original barriers thousands of years ago. Voice of the Deep addressed the entire chamber, though it spoke in such a way that each person seemed to hear it in their own language, seemed to understand its meaning at the deepest level of their consciousness. It said that it had come to witness the renewal of the ancient pacts and to establish its personal commitment to the agreement. It said that it remembered the times of peace, and that it had waited through the long ages of separation in hope that someday the world would be ready for harmony once again. Voice of the Deep extended what might have been hands or might have been appendages of pure energy toward Thomas and Maya. It invited them to seal the agreement with a formal ceremony that would bind the surface and depths together in a way that would be recognized not just legally, but magically. Thomas looked at Maya, and she could see that he understood the significance of what was being offered. This was not just a political agreement, but a metaphysical joining, a reshaping of the fundamental reality of Karath 9. Thomas accepted the invitation, and Maya stepped forward as well. Voice of the Deep brought them together with its energy, and for a moment that existed both outside and within time, Maya experienced something extraordinary. She saw the history of Karath 9 stretching back millions of years, saw the civilizations that had risen and fallen, saw the magical beings that had shaped this world through ages that humans could barely comprehend. She saw the separation and the loneliness of both sides, and she understood that this moment was truly a turning point, a place where two worlds that had been divided would finally begin to heal. When the vision ended, Maya found herself on her knees, tears streaming down her face, with Thomas beside her looking equally moved. Voice of the Deep was fading, returning to the depths, but not before radiating a feeling of profound peace and hope. Keeper of Memory remained, waiting patiently for the humans to recover from their experience. The formal integration process began immediately. Over the following weeks, teams of underground creatures worked alongside human and elf teams to establish the new settlements. Claire led survey expeditions that mapped out 12 different cave systems suitable for immediate development. Thomas coordinated the logistics of moving resources and establishing trade routes between the surface colony and the growing underground communities. Maya worked tirelessly as a translator and mediator, helping to resolve disputes and misunderstandings that inevitably arose when two fundamentally different civilizations tried to learn to live together. There were challenges and conflicts. Some humans were still afraid of the underground creatures and did not want to work alongside them. There were underground beings who felt that the surface dwellers were not honoring the agreements or were exploiting the situation for their own benefit. But for every conflict, there were also moments of genuine connection and understanding. Claire formed a genuine friendship with one of the underground creatures, a being dedicated to geological science that she called Stone Scholar. Together they made discoveries about Karath 9's structure that benefited both civilizations. Thomas found that he could communicate and work effectively with Keeper of Memory, and a deep respect grew between them as they jointly governed the integration process. 3 months into the integration, the first permanent underground settlement was completed. It was a marvel of engineering, with chambers carved from the living rock of the planet and illuminated by crystal formations that seemed to generate their own light. The opening ceremony was attended by both surface and underground representatives, and it felt like a beginning of something genuinely new. A hybrid culture was starting to form, neither fully surface nor fully underground, but something that combined the best aspects of both. Maya stood on a ridge, overlooking the growing settlement, and felt a sense of peace that she had not experienced in years. Kresh and Amara were beside her, as they always were, their presence a constant comfort and reminder of why she had come to Karath 9 in the first place. The dragons had become symbols of unity between the populations, and both humans and underground creatures trusted them in a way that sometimes surpassed the trust they had for each other. Claire approached her at sunset, bringing tea that had been brewed from both surface plants and underground mineral-based preparations. She said that she had been thinking about staying on Karath 9 permanently, about establishing a research center that would study the planet's geology and the history of both civilizations. She asked Maya if she thought that was a good idea. Maya said she thought it was an excellent idea, and that Karath 9 would benefit greatly from having someone as dedicated and brilliant as Claire, contributing to its future. Thomas appeared as well, and they sat together in silence for a while, just watching the twin moons rise over the canyon and the lights of the settlements beginning to glow in the darkness. Thomas said that he had received a communication from the Federation. The central government wanted to know what had happened on Karath 9, whether the colony had been destroyed or if the situation had been resolved. He was planning to send them a report that would explain the integration in present Karath 9 as a model for how humans and other intelligent species could learn to coexist.